When asked to actually come along and MC today's event, I was quite excited to be able to do so for a couple of reasons. Firstly, from my background in journalism and social research, this notion of the impact that technology has on business and society, and therefore the impact that it has on jobs or tasks or however we choose to define how we spend our professional time, is something that I personally have been looking at for a good 20 years now. It's also an experience that I've had from a very personal perspective. Now, as an MC, part of my role, I guess, today is to challenge both our speakers and panellists, as well as those of you in the audience, to ensure that you are engaging and broadening out the questions that are asked of you. And I'd start with a statement, which is to say that anyone who enters into a conversation believing how they know how it will end was never actually intending to have a conversation. So please do ensure that you are engaging and keeping an open mind to what is described today. There are no easy answers. So when you do hear a perspective that perhaps you disagree with, do take the time to delve a little bit deeper into how that perspective might have been formed. The other point that I want to raise, though, I guess, is the lived experience that I've had with this particular issue. Now, I've come out of the media industry. I worked as a journalist starting off in 1995 in the technology space of all places, so I've been writing about this stuff as it's been happening. And in the mid-1990s, I found my way to a newspaper many of you would know called The Australian. We've all heard of that? Great, good. Now, in the mid-1990s, particularly the late 1990s, if you wanted to hire somebody in the tech industry, you put a job ad in The Australian. If you were looking for a job in the tech industry in the particularly to the late 1990s, we had Y2K coming up, we had the dot-com boom going on, you looked in The Australian. Anyone actually in this room ever do either of those two activities? I know some of you might be a little bit young. Okay, good, I'm glad to see I'm amongst my crew here. About half of you had hands go up. Now, as a result of that behaviour, our little technology section, which we published on a Tuesday, blew out to 56 broadsheet pages. The editorial team within which I worked was struggling on an ongoing basis just to pad out the ads. Now, from a commercial perspective, which of course as a journalist I never saw, but for the people upstairs, this was fantastic. This money just kept pouring in week after week because we really were, maybe with the exception of the AFR, the only place you would advertise a technology role. We've hit the jackpot. Things were going better than you could ever imagine. Of course, this will never end, will it? Now, of course, it does end because back in the 1990s, early 1990s, Tim Berners-Lee and his friends at CERN were writing what went on to become the World Wide Web. A technology inflection point which was examined and studied by various parties, some to a high degree, some to a lower degree. Perhaps by my employers, not necessarily to the degree that we needed to, but certainly to a high degree by a group of investors who went on to form a small little company that many of you might have heard of called Seek. And you can probably now assume where this story is going, that the 56 broadsheet pages that we published on a Tuesday very quickly diminished from 56 down to a level now where, despite the best efforts of my former colleagues, it's getting harder and harder to actually find the technology section in the Australian newspaper on a Tuesday. Now, these changes take time, but when you're living amongst them, they happen very quickly. Now, I moved on from the Australian to Business Review Weekly, a magazine, may it rest in peace, that when I joined was doing $1 million a week per edition on display advertising. Of course, that magazine ceased to exist some years ago as well. So media as an industry is one that has very much been a canary in the coal mine around this. So if you do wonder
at times why media, you can see on this chart over the last 25 years, there has been an enormous change in the Australian labour market.
When you fail to adapt quickly enough.
At the top end of the spectrum,
and from my own perspective, it's been an interesting story and personal experience to live through.
Have increased by 87%.
Who have been doing the same thing for 20 years.
Healthcare workers
and being rewarded for
disability
doing the
workers,
same thing for 20 years.
Childcare workers.
In many cases being awarded for doing the same thing
right
for 20
across
years.
the caring economy, which has
to
grown
one day have
so
somebody
rapidly.
further up the food
Professionals have been growing strongly as well. At the other end of the spectrum,
the community no
there's
longer
been
values what you do to the same
enormous
level they once
change
did,
in the
so
other
we
direction.
No longer require your services.
Australia has lost nearly
what I'd
400,000
ask you to keep in
labouring
mind
jobs,
as we think about
nearly
the discussion that we're having
500,000
today,
clerical
is that this
administration
is a
and
very
secretarial
human
jobs
discussion.
have disappeared from the Australian
Now,
economy.
I said at the outset
over the last
that the solution
25
to these
years.
issues that we discussed, they may actually
This
have no
is
solution.
enormous
They may need to
churn
have
and
a solution.
change And you can understand why it's generating anxiety.
But it requires
right
all of us to pull together, and it requires us all to pull together for two reasons, because the problems that we are
the outlook for young people is
too complex for any single group to deal
even more
with.
concerning.
This
Remember
is not
that,
something
of
that
course,
government
young
can do on
people
its own.
often
This
take
is not
those
something
jobs
that
that
any
are
individual technology
the first
company
couple
can
of
do on
rungs
its
on the
own,
ladder
that no individual community
of
group
the career
can do on its own.
development.
We are part of a society, and we are in a
those
society
are
that changes,
precisely
so
the
therefore all
jobs
members of society
that
have an
are
obligation to
most
be a part of that
quickly
change
being
process.
lost to automation.
But we need also to remember
The checkout job
that
in a
the issues
supermarket
that we are
being
describing
replaced
can impact us
by,
all at a very, very
self-checkout
personal level.
machine.
Quick
Even
question
the
for
job
you.
as a junior
Who
lawyer
amongst you
being
is doing
replaced
exactly
by
the same job that you were doing
artificial
5 years ago?
intelligence and software. At all ends
One,
of the spectrum,
okay.
the
Two,
jobs that our young
academic,
people will be
maybe.
starting
Who
their
amongst
careers
you
with
is only
are
using the
disappearing
same
from the
skill set that
economy
you
at
were
an
using
increasing
5
rate.
years ago?
70% of young
Right,
people
so even if we're doing the
enter
same job,
jobs
we're doing it differently
which
now, aren't we?
are in
So
the
we all
highest
know
category
inherently
of
that we
risk
do have a
to
capability
automation.
to change and adapt. We need
How
to therefore
are we
couple that
preparing
knowledge
for this change?
with the knowledge that we are also responsible
Well,
for
if
guiding
you just
our
do a
own
simple
careers to some
exercise,
extent, and that we
you look
can't
at
be
every
reliant
Australian
on third parties to
student
do this for us.
Today.
So it's that interesting
What
confluence
course
between
are
the
they
bigger
studying?
picture and the very small picture.
What are the
the
possible
individual level, which I
occupations
think is
that
worthy of
those
discussion
courses
today.
are leading them
But to
towards?
give you perhaps another framework for thinking about what is happening and why it is happening, this is not happening as a result of technology. All right? Technology, once created, will sit happily doing nothing until we choose to do something with it. It is our application of technology which is driving the changes that we describe today. How that technology is applied is a choice that we as humans make. So if we think, therefore, perhaps taking my example and moving on, in the world of media, the movement of classified advertising from print to online was very much driven by the idea that advertising online was just easier. You did not need to create physical media and send it to a location to have it run at a specific time. You could jump on your laptop at 2 o'clock in the morning and place a job ad. It was a significant shortcut between getting what you wanted, which was the job ad placed, or ultimately the job being filled, which eliminated a series of steps that you needed to do. And if you think about what's happening in the world today, in this world of digital transformation, much of what we are describing is actually a series of shortcuts which we have introduced in order to compress the time between between expressing what we want and receiving what we want. To take Amazon as an example, I want the new Harry Potter book. When I was a child, I needed to wait for the bookstore to open. I needed to convince my mother to drive me to the bookstore to buy it, and I needed to hope the bookstore hadn't sold out. Amazon eliminated many of those steps. All I needed to do now was borrow my mother's credit card, go online and buy the book. Amazon realised that that did not solve all of the problem because I had to then wait for the book, hence the introduction of the Kindle and similar devices. We were able to take a process that required a number of steps that we needed to do because we had no choice and compress that down. The ability to get from the expression of what I wanted to the fulfilment of what I wanted was compressed. We have seen that happen across industry after industry after industry, the entertainment industry being one of the most significant representations of this. Now take that forward one step further into the world of work that most of us occupy. One of the things that I want, running a proprietary limited business, is to be compliant with Australian taxation regulation. To all of my friends in the room from the ATO, I really want to be compliant with Australian taxation legislation. Unfortunately, in order to be compliant with something which for my feeble brain it's too complicated to comprehend, I need an accountant. Now, to the gentleman at the back of the room who described himself as being a former accountant, you probably saw the light. Unfortunately, I don't want an accountant, but I need one. I've said this to my accountant. I quite like my accountant, but I have said, Irwin, come the day where I no longer need you, I'm not going to be paying you anymore. And he knows that. He is now asking himself the question, well, if Brad no longer needs me, because many of the tasks that I as an accountant do follow rules, and rules can equally be well followed by a computer, therefore automated out, what will I be able to give to Brad that Brad will actually want? And it's a very interesting conundrum that many business people have to face today because they are coming to the realisation that if there's something that you need but not something that you want, how much longer will you be needed? At what point will a system be able to do, as Andrew said, the mechanical, laborious components that you used to be able to charge billable hours for? Well, if we give that to a machine, we can get what we want without requiring the human input. We can go one step further into law. Many of the lower functions in a law firm are now being done via automated systems. Now, myself, I've not had to engage a lawyer for any significant period of time now, and hopefully never will have to again. I actually never want to have to need a lawyer. But at that point in time, if I want justice, yes, a lawyer might be needed. But at what point in time will I be able to get what I want without needing those stages in between? So we need to be asking ourselves a very basic question when it comes to understanding what the future of jobs, and particularly the future of the tasks within the job that we do, will actually be. What tasks are we doing today which are needed, and what tasks are we doing today are actually wanted? And if we are finding ourselves caught in a place where we are simply needed rather than wanted, how much longer will we be needed for? And once you ask yourself that question, you can then start to ask yourself, well, if I'm no longer needed, how do I make myself wanted? People's wants don't change significantly over time. How they're expressed will, and how we can actually fulfil those wants will. So we need, as I said at the beginning, to be thinking about this very much at two levels. We need to be thinking about this issue at the macro level, the bigger picture level, of pulling together as industry associations and employer groups and government in order to discuss and hopefully solve some of the challenges that we face. But we also need to be standing as individuals asking ourselves, what does this mean to me? And how do I ensure my relevance as I move forward? Because at some point we do need to take personal responsibility for career development. And if we stand as necessary evils today in order to get somebody something that they want, then how much longer will we be necessary for? So as we move through today, I will challenge all of you in this room to ask the questions you need to ask to solve or at least raise the issues. There is a degree of fear that sits out there. Andrew recognised that in his presentation, but that doesn't mean these fears can't be overcome through greater awareness. So take the time during the sessions, during the breaks, to raise awareness and to alleviate the fears you might have, to challenge yourselves in your own thinking, but ultimately to remember that behind every single statistic that you see today is a human being who's having to also contend with these issues. So I would also challenge you when discussing the topics today to do so with a degree of compassion and empathy, because ultimately when it comes down to the future of jobs and the future of work, it is a very human challenge that we describe.